Welcome to Vintage Reviews. I am George, and today I'm excited to talk about the first film on my channel, and the film I chose was Them from 1954, directed by Gordon Douglas. Now, this movie can be summed up in two words: giant ants. So the film starts out in the New Mexican desert, and there's this police sergeant named Ben Peterson. He's played by James Whitmore. You probably recognize James Whitmore. He was Brooks in the movie Shawshank Redemption. Remember that part? Brooks was here. He's that guy. And so he and his partner, they find this child wandering through the desert, and they soon determine that there are giant ants that are attacking the locals in the area. And so Sergeant Peterson ends up hooking up with this FBI agent named Robert Graham, and he's played by James Arness. Now, you probably recognize James Arness as well, because shortly after this movie came out, he got cast as Marshall Dillon in the show Gunsmoke, and that was a very popular show. It ran for like 20 years. And so that's James Arness. He plays Robert Graham, the FBI agent. And so they also team up with this pair of scientists. It's a father and daughter team, and they're played by Edmund Gwenn and Joan Weldon. And so this is Dr. Harold Munford and his daughter, Patricia Pat Munford. And they are like bug experts. And with the four of them, they go around and they finally discover that there is a nest in this area, and they take the nest out. And then soon after that, Harold Munford, the doctor, he explains that it was the nuclear testing in 1945 during World War II that caused the radiation that caused these ants to mutate. But then another problem comes up when they discover that there were two queen ants that flew away before they were able to destroy the nest in New Mexico. And so this is a problem because these queen ants can start a colony and hatch thousands of eggs, and there would be thousands of killer ants out there, and so we can't have that. And so what we end up finding out is that these queens made it to Los Angeles, and they're setting up shop in the sewers and the catacombs underneath Los Angeles. And so Peterson and Graham, they need to get the army together and go after and find these nests and take care of these giant ants. And that's essentially the plot of the story. There's also some cool stuff in there. There's a couple of cameos I'll mention. One of them is Leonard Nimoy when he was young. It was a really early part for him. It's one of those, if you blink, you'll miss it moments. But it's really cool. I was watching it the other day. I was like, okay, yes, this is great. And then all of a sudden, here comes Spock. And I'm like, oh, there's Leonard Nimoy. Awesome. And I've totally forgot about that. And it was kind of a surprise. And another one is Fess Parker. And that's interesting because not long after this, he got cast in the very popular Disney serial Davy Crockett. And I actually used to watch those Davy Crockett reruns when I was a kid. So I always liked Fess Parker. And it's kind of cool to see him in this. He plays this guy who witnessed the ants flying away, and because the army and the cops don't want a panic, they end up putting Fess Parker in a mental hospital, but in reality what he saw was real, and it's kind of a funny, interesting scene with him. And so there is some trivia that I looked up and I wanted to mention in this video. Now, I will say that this is just stuff I've gleaned off the internet. I am not a film historian. I did not interview Joan Weldon and get the scoop on all this stuff. It's just some things I gleaned, but it's interesting stuff I like, so I thought I'd bring it up. So one thing is, the flamethrowers used in this movie were standard World War II issue weapons. They were on loan from the U.S. Army. The actors handling these flamethrowers, these World War II weapons in the film, were actually veterans who used them in World War II. So isn't that pretty badass? I mean, these guys are out there in World War II, and then they're in this movie using these flamethrowers. I just thought that was really cool. And then another thing to kind of piggyback on the Fess Parker cameo, Walt Disney actually screened this movie because he was interested in casting James Arness as Davy Crockett. So he watched this movie, and so when he saw Fess Parker, he got interested in him and ended up casting Fess Parker as Davy Crockett. But like I said, James Arness soon after went on to be Marshall Dillon, so it worked out for both of them. So I thought that was pretty cool. The viewer never sees more than 3 ants in this movie. And that's because they use these prosthetic puppet ants, and they can only afford to make 3 of them. So you never see more than 3 ants in the movie. I actually think that's really cool because, we're used to the modern day CGI, and, we would see hundreds of ants running around. But this was the days before that, and they had to rely on story and characters, and they only had 3 ants, and they had to make it work, and I think it does work really well. And then also to kind of add to that, we don't see any ants at all until almost a half an hour into the movie. It's like minute 23 before we actually see an ant show up on screen. And that's something interesting to note because, like I said before, if it were modern days, it'd be CGI. In the first scene, you'd have 100 ants running around tearing things up or whatever. But they had to be a little bit more subtle about it. They had to build suspense and then reveal the ants a little bit later into the film because they were limited by technology and they only had so many ants to work with. And I think that actually informed the storytelling and made it rather interesting. So I like that. So I'd like to say a few things about some of the things I liked about the film and why I chose to cover it today. And first thing is, what is not to like? It's giant ants and it's James Arness. Come on. It doesn't get much better than that when you're talking classic monster movie. That's great stuff. But also, I really like the character that James Whitmore plays, the Sergeant Ben Peterson. He is just a very stoic, very all-American, root for this guy, good guy type character. And I liked him a lot. I actually found myself really rooting for him throughout the movie. He does the character really well, and it's just a well-written and interesting and enjoyable character to watch, and I urge you to check it out just for his performance because it's really good. And then, here's another funny thing I noticed that I wanted to talk about. I also like how Peterson is a state trooper and Graham is an FBI agent, but when the fighting starts, they end up donning army fatigues and they just jump right into battle with flamethrowers and bazookas like the regular soldiers. And I think that's an interesting thing to note. This was only 9 years removed from World War II. And so I guess we're just supposed to assume that anyone in an authority figure position in the early, mid-1950s was probably a former soldier. And so when the chips are down, they're just going to jump right back into that role again. And we as an audience are just going to go along with it because they don't really explain it. They just start, being like soldiers right away, and it's totally acceptable in the story. And I just think that's an interesting thing to note. I also like how this kind of kicks off the whole Cold War fear of nuclear weapons testing idea. It's the idea that these bombs make this radiation, and we don't know what it's going to do, and the radiation mutated these creatures and turned them into monsters. Like I said, this is only 9 years removed from the bombing testing at Los Alamos at the end of World War II. And, I imagine in 1954, people didn't really know what to expect from these weapons and what they could do. And this kind of kicked off that idea, kind of, like Godzilla. Godzilla is a monster made from radiation. So very similar to that. And that ended up becoming kind of a trope later on. But this isn't the early time of that, and I think it's interesting to watch the movie just to see it from that dynamic as well. And I also think the ants are well done. Now, like I said, these are puppets, these are animatronic, these are practical effects, and they can only afford to make 3 of them. That's why I only see 3 ants at a time. But I think they're done well. They look pretty good for what they are. I do think, though, how cool would it have been if they would have had stop-go animation ants? I think that would have been really neat to have that kind of effect in this. That might have gave it a little bit of a different angle. But I imagine that was probably time-consuming and expensive to do, so they just went with the puppet animatronic stuff, and it works. I think they're pretty cool. So again, the movie is Them, 1954, a classic, one I really enjoy. Have you seen it? If not, you definitely should check it out. If so, do you have any thoughts on it? I would love to hear what you have to think about the film, or if you have any questions, please just sign off in the comments, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. So again, thanks for taking the time to watch. I really appreciate it. Until the next time, have a good one.